Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen and it's your job to draw what you see. We'll have an artist joining us, doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It is entirely up to you. Once the session is finished, don't forget to post your work onto Instagram and hashtag it with #RawUmberLive. You can also download the reference photographs and watch this video again after the session is finished. So if the artist is going too fast for you, don't worry. You can watch the video now and then watch it again later on. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this latest Raw Umber portrait drawing video. In this 1-hour pose, I will take you through the beginning to the end of a portrait drawing, and I'm going to be focusing on mass drawing. For this I'll be using both willow charcoal as well as charcoal pencil. And when using willow charcoal, it's always a good idea to sand it. So I've got a sanding pad here, and I just lay my charcoal almost horizontal across, and with very light pressure I can sand this into a wedge shape. As you can see, a little bit more of a wedge shape. This opens up the grain of the charcoal and makes it easier for me to draw. Now, like I said, I'm also using a compressed charcoal pencil for the detail. It's always handy to have some blending tools on hand. This can be anything from a brush, a stump, or a soft pastel knife. And finally, I like to use a grey putty rubber to erase. And all of these materials can be found in the materials box below the video. Now, the first thing I want to do is tone the paper, and for this I'm using an old bit of charcoal, again sand it to open up the grain, and I'm just going to cover the whole of my paper with this charcoal. And the goal here is to create a nice mid-tone. I'm using a bit of kitchen roll here to just blend it together and get rid of any texture. Now, a good way to test if you've gone dark enough with your mid-tone is by using the rubber to create a highlight. If this really pops out, you've gone dark enough. If it doesn't quite pop out enough, or you're not sure, just darken it a little bit more. So this seems like it pops out enough. So I'm going to start the drawing, and I always start with some basic measurements. Now I want to make sure that the face fits onto the page. So I'm going to find the widest point, which I see as the back of the hair and the tip of the nose. And I'm going to mark this onto the page. Now if I make a square shape here, I can see that the bottom of the chin to the top of the hair is roughly the same size. So this is always a good place to start, because we know that these are our true measurements. These are the same length as height, and from here we can start breaking things down further. Now, for those of you new to the videos, what I tend to do to measure is hold my pencil up to the paper and see how many times it fits. So for instance, to find the midpoint, I know that my pencil should fit twice into the square I made. And this lines up nicely with the eyebrows in this drawing. So really what we're doing is just dividing the space into halves, for instance. So again, dividing the top of the hair to the eyebrow into 2 equal parts. I can see that's the top of the forehead, which is going backwards into the hair. Now this type of measuring works vertically but also horizontally. So for instance, dividing the face into 2 equal parts from side to side, I can see that is the front of the earlobe. Now of course, these measurements aren't set in stone. We may find that stuff needs to move as we carry on, but I do find it useful to add a few measurements at the start as a sort of framework on which we can start building the portrait. For instance, now I've got the forehead, I can start just enveloping the hair. And for this, I'm using straight lines. Now the reason I like to use straight lines is that they're very easy to move and they force me into making a decision. I have to decide how long the line is, as well as if it's straight or at an angle. Whereas with curves, we tend to just go for a round shape, which doesn't really force us into making decisions. So coming back to the measurements, we've got the top to bottom, as well as the midpoint from side to side. So this gives us the middle of the portrait. And I can see that this is roughly where the hairline starts to go towards the side of the forehead. And like I said, I'm using a straight line for this, trying to find the correct angle or the slope of the line. And this brings me to the next useful drawing tool, and this is parallel lines. When I'm looking and comparing the side of the brow to the hairline, I can see that these are roughly 2 parallel lines, and I can often just judge this by eye or measure it to find the right distance. Going down from this top of the brow that we've just found, I can divide that to the chin into 2 equal parts to find the bottom of the nose. And this lines up nicely as well with the bottom of the ear. And as we can see, the ears at a slight angle, and this then leads into the angle of the jawline. So a lot of this drawing stuff is looking at the face as a big puzzle of lines and angles. And when you find one angle, that leads you into finding another, and so on. Now this drawing is all about mass drawing, and I want to switch to this as quick as possible. So when looking at the chin, I can see it starts from the corner of the brow and turns down towards the pit of the neck, and this gives us a sort of Y-shaped dark shadow. And what I'm going to do instead of outline this is actually just color this in using the side of my charcoal, making this into a big dark mass. And if you want, you can use a blending tool to just get rid of extra bits of texture, stuff like that. And what we've got then is a nice clear dark shape, and this is something that we'll be using a lot as we progress into the video. Now I'm just going to finish using those straight lines to measure some of the other areas that I need before progressing into this mass drawing, which is drawing using big masses of light and dark. So continuing this puzzle of shapes, we can make that framework that we're later gonna fill in using the dark as well as the light shapes. For instance, have a look at what we call a negative shape, the background in between the bottom of the chin and the shoulder. This is a nice little square shape that we can use to find the bottom of the shoulder. And this is what I really like about this mass drawing approach. Instead of drawing, for instance, the chin, we're really just looking at shapes of the background versus the shadow shape of the neck and the chin. And the more we can simplify these, the easier the drawing will be, because instead of having to draw a chin or an eye or a nose, we're just drawing squares and triangles using straight lines and really simplifying these. And this, even if it seems a bit counterintuitive or even counterproductive, actually makes the drawing a lot easier. Now once I've got this rough framework of lines, not yet having any features or anything like that, working from big shapes to small shapes, I can start filling in these darker shapes that I see, for instance the rest of the neck. Now again, once we have this big block of dark in, we can start erasing into this, again using the mass drawing principle. So I can see a nice bright sort of cone shape going into that neck, into that dark mass of the neck. And so I can use my finger or a blending tool to erase into this. Now you don't want to use a rubber for this, even though that may feel more natural, because then we're going too light and erasing that mid-tone. So use a blending tool or your finger. Now looking at these dark and light shapes, you can imagine that as light is coming from the top, anything that's turning under is a plane that the light can't reach. An obvious example of this is of course the bottom of the chin, but also the bottom of the brow going into the eyes. So to simplify this again, I'm just looking for the top of the brow to the corners of the eyes, and I'm just making this all into one dark shape. Now it's good to note here that often we will naturally straighten things out. So really look at the angle of the brows as well as the angle of the corners of the eyes. And this will show us the angle of the head. Now once we've got this angle, it means that the nose will also be at this angle as well as the lips. So for the nose, I'm using again just a simple dark shape to indicate the bottom plane of the nose. And what I'm trying to do with this method is try to show you a different way of seeing. So instead of thinking in terms of lines, which is what a lot of people tend to do naturally, is we're thinking in terms of blocks. So looking at the forehead, instead of having an outline there, we can darken the background. And this gives us a nice light block for the forehead, with the rest of the area surrounding it being a dark shape. So really outlines are just the sides of these dark or light shapes. Now thinking in this blocky manner, looking at the eye sockets, we can see there's a light shape in between the brows going towards the bridge of the nose. So using my finger here or a blending tool or by the kitchen roll, I can erase into my shadow shape and find that lighter block. And almost, to me at least, as if by magic, a nose starts to appear, even though we really just have a triangle at the bottom of the nose, another sort of Y shape on the side of the nose, and we haven't really outlined the side of the nose at all. So again, thinking in these terms of dark block versus light block can really help create a more realistic drawing. Squinting can be really helpful for this. So for instance, if I'm looking at the cheekbone and squint at the image, I can see there's a sort of arrow shape going from the top of the eye socket and around the eye socket towards the top of the cheekbone. And once I squint at the picture, I can just judge the distances by eye and try and block this in. Same thing for the nose, as well as the mouth. Looking at the light distance between the bottom of the nose and the top lip, I can try and judge this by eye by squinting at the picture. Then we can see that the top lip, as well as the inside of the mouth, are both dark shapes. Going towards the bottom lip, which we can see is a light shape, and another dark shape underneath that bottom lip. And again, try to really simplify these shapes into straight lines, looking at the angle and the distance between those shapes. So really all I've drawn here is just a triangular shape for the top lip, a flat shape at an angle for the lower lip, and not a dark triangle underneath that lower lip. And our brains just interpret this as lips. And this happens all the time in real life as well, which is why this is such a useful way to draw. Now next we're going to start putting in the light shapes, but before you do so, have a look at the drawing and double check any measurements. For instance, for me, I can see that the hair just doesn't have enough volume at the top, so I can measure this and double check it and correct it while keeping it pretty simple. Now, while I'm making these corrections, if you have any questions at all, as always, I'm here in the chat, so let me know if you have any questions if you're watching this live. So we're about halfway down the pose and we've got most of our dark masses in. So now, using the same technique, I'm going to use my grey putty rubber to find the lighter shapes. I'm going to start with the hair here because it's a bit easier, first of all, and also because there's some really nice clear light shapes there. So starting at the forehead, I can squint at the hair and just try to imitate the shapes that I see using the rubber. Try not to draw individual hairs here. Try to look at it as light shapes only. And try not to think about what you're drawing. So, for instance, at the top of the hair, I can see it's a zigzag, almost lightning bolts, so the shape. So try to put this in. I can see more of a triangular shape near the ear. And cracking like this, again, I'm training my eye to see just shapes. Now the outline we put at the start may be a bit too harsh right now, so feel free to blend this in using your finger or a blending tool and let the hair just disappear in and out of the background. It can be surprising, but actually losing some of the outline can actually make the drawing feel more realistic. Right, now moving onwards towards the rest of the portrait, going towards the pit of the neck, I can see a downwards arrow shape with a thin area in the middle going up towards the ear and a sort of heart shape underneath that. So again, squinting at this area and trying to just copy those shapes as clearly as I can using the rubber. Alright, so now we're a little bit more warmed up. Let's have a look at the light shapes in the actual portrait. And a clear one I can see already is the bridge of the nose, going from around the top of the eyelids all the way to the tip of the nose. And of course, while you're doing this, if you see any corrections that need to be made, feel free to make these. I can see, for instance, the tip of the nose needs to come out a little bit more. It's always good to work on a drawing if you see any small drawing mistakes. Next, moving into the eye, I can see a nice light shape on the top of the cheekbone. So they're starting at the outer corner of the eye and going upwards towards the side of the forehead, framing that eye socket. Now going towards the other side of the eye, I can see next to the inner corner of the eye another light shape. So we can see that these light shapes are framing the eye socket itself and helping shape it. Again, try to think in terms of straight lines and big blocks of light, just like we did in the darks. If you find you need to correct something and the charcoal is a little bit hard to control or not quite precise enough, feel free to start using a black colored pencil or a pastel pencil or even a charcoal pencil for this to give you a little bit more precision. I'm using a black colored pencil for the softer dark tones, and a compressed charcoal pencil by Generals for the darker tones. It's a really nice way to just add that little bit of precision to the shapes we've been making. So while I'm still adding in my light shapes, for instance in the forehead, you may also notice that as I'm working with these pencils, I'm getting more and more precise. And that's really what finishing is all about. I'm not changing techniques, I'm just making my shapes smaller and smaller as I get nearer to the finish of the drawing. So for instance here, looking at the bottom of the nostril, I'm just using the charcoal pencil to really carve out those dark shapes. We can see that the light shape sort of enters the bottom of the nostril there. So again, I'm not adding any more shapes here. I'm really not adding any more values or tones. I'm just refining the three tones I've already got: the dark, the mid-tone and the light. So for instance on the lip here, I can start looking at the dark shape a bit more clearly, and then we can see that the inside of the mouth is a bit darker. So I'm covering this using my charcoal pencil, and then I can actually see that the side of the top lip is a bit lighter. So I'm using my blending tool for this. I'm getting this shape a little bit more precise. Now, of course, the nostril, for instance, is a little bit darker than other areas, so feel free to add this in. But keep in mind that stuff like the nostrils are very rarely something you want to put focus on. So if you do decide to put this in, blend it in a little bit more than you would naturally do to reduce the focus to that part of the drawing. Now coming back to the eye, going in with the compressed charcoal, we can see there's a darker shape. It's a bit more precise, which is the iris, which is connected to the diagonal shape of the eyelashes. And finally, we can see this connected to the triangular shape of the inside of the brow. So again, just adjusting these dark shapes can give us a more precise eye from the more simplified shape we had earlier on. Now looking at the lights, I can see there's a bit more of a half tone going into the brow and top of the lids. Maybe there's space for a little light shape there that I can carve out using a rubber. Now what I love about this technique is that we've just drawn an eye, but really all we've done is drawn light shapes, mid-tone shapes and dark shapes, and this together creates that eye. So now I've got these nice clear shapes. It's a good idea to soften them into one another a bit. Of course, I've been simplifying all this time and I have made them a lot simpler than they are in real life. So what I'm going to do next is let them blend and gradate into one another a little bit more. For instance, here around the cheekbone. I can also see that the forehead doesn't have such a clear dark line surrounding it. It's really quite light around the eyebrow and then it gets darker towards the background. So again, I'm trying to blend this in and create a nice gradation. And this can be tricky because once we start blending, we lose our shapes. We have to put our shapes back and then we lose the blending. So there's always an element of going back and forth with a drawing like this. And for me, that's sort of part of the fun. It's almost like I'm using oil paint or acrylic paint. Generally, I try to soften areas that I know should be round. So for instance, the bottom of the chin as well as the bottom of the jaw, I know should be rounded. So instead of having this really strong outline there, I'm going to let this blend and gradate into the mid-tone of the paper a little bit more. And of course, while you do this, you may see drawing mistakes or anything you want to change. And I would always do it if you see it. And hopefully these little mistakes get smaller and smaller as we are drawing. But it's always good to address them if and when we see them. So I can see that the chin needs to drop down a little bit, for instance. So I'm just drawing this out and I'm blending this back in. Now, as we're working on this, you may notice that we're getting near to the finish of the drawing. And at this stage, the finish of a drawing, the style of the drawing starts to get a little bit more personal. Some people like a rougher finish, some people like a more blended finish. But what every style of drawing has in common is elements of design, and one of these elements is the focal point. So where do I want the viewer to look versus where do I not want the viewer to look? Now in most portraits this will be the features. You want the viewer to look at the features and not, for instance in this drawing, at the neck or the hair. So in order to make the neck and the hair stand out a little bit less, I am blending these together, making them darker, to make the contrast focus itself on the features and not on the background. So even though there's actually a lot happening inside of the neck, we can see some light reflecting back into the bottom of the chin. We can see some muscles there. I'm simplifying this and letting this be all blended together in order to support the focus of the face. Same thing with the back of the head and the hair. Of course, there's a lot of texture happening there, but again, I want the focus to be on the face, so I'm leaving this a lot more simplified. Now the ear can look really bright inside of all these shadows, but again we don't want the viewer to really look at the ear that much. We would prefer the viewer generally to look at the features. So with the ear I'm going to put a few shapes in, but I'm not going to make it quite as bright as I did with the features in order to make it a secondary focal point and not a primary focal point. Same thing with the back of the neck. We can see that's really, really dark, almost the darkest part of the drawing. And I do put this in, but then I'm gonna blend it together to make it softer and have a little bit less contrast than what I see. Again, to support that sense of focus in the features. You may actually find that these areas are much harder to draw because the tendency will be there to want to put all the detail in. And so we have to hold back so much when we're drawing these areas while still hinting at the shapes. And of course the tendency can be there to put a little bit too much detail there. So it can be a useful thing to step back a bit or squint at the drawing and just check where your eye naturally goes. If it's going to areas where you don't want the viewer to go, bring the contrast a bit closer together or soften some edges. Now everything I've just said mostly has been about the neck and the shadows, but of course the same thing goes for the highlights. And once again, looking at that focal point, we want the contrast to be in the features and not in the hair. So even though the hair is really light, I'm just going to go over this, glazing over this, so very light pressure with my charcoal to bring it together a bit more, give it a little less contrast and hopefully guide the viewer's eye towards the features. You can even do this with the background itself. You can lose some areas of the neck or the shoulders in the background and let the features pop out again. And this all supports that sense of focal point and the sense of focus in a drawing. Now, of course, I'm using the features as my main focal points, but you could do this with other body parts. You can have a portrait completely focused on the ear or on the hair. And that's so great about this sense of focal point or this technique, that you can decide as the artist where you want to put the focus and where you want to lead the viewer's eye. So a lot of this focal point stuff is about softening. And of course, I talk a lot about reducing contrast. On the other hand, I may want to add contrast near the features. So for instance, to add contrast there, I could lighten the background underneath the chin to give that more contrast and therefore guide the eye towards us. Lastly, another thing I like to do is find some lost edges. So at the moment I've got an outline all along the outside of the face, but I can actually lose this a bit where I see the light, for instance in the chin here, but also at the tip of the nose or the forehead. And I often just feel like that looks a bit better because we're sort of melting the face into the background. We're letting the face interact with the background a bit more. Well, at this point, we're almost at the end of the pose and the end of the time available. So I'm just going to continue playing with the drawing in this manner. And if you have any questions at all, let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live, and otherwise I will speak to you at the end of the pose. Alright, so that's the end of the post. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you feel like you've learned something about mass drawing. Now, if you use Instagram, you can show us your work using the hashtag #RawUmberLive, or alternatively, you can show it here in the chat using the photograph button at the bottom right of the chat.
I hope you enjoyed the session and thank you for taking part. Don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 PM and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 PM. The last portrait session of every month is free. Thank you and goodbye.